Hello, everyone. Welcome to Culture Shock, the podcast where movie lovers and history nerds unite. I'm your host, Luke Schweiss. I've been a passionate film obsessive for my entire 22 years of existence, and I seek to bring a unique mix of academia and history to the film discourse sphere. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Culture Shock. For our second episode, we will be talking about the period piece. I know anyone that's a movie buff out there is probably very familiar with the term, and even if you're not, it's pretty self-explanatory. This episode we're going to focus on the history of the period piece and what genres are typically associated with it, and how that's kind of changed throughout film history, and what stories have come and gone in terms of popularity and how they have shaped the overall resilience of this genre in filmmaking. The first section of history that we'll be talking about when it comes to the period piece is the golden age of Hollywood. Now, this isn't essentially where the period piece was invented. There's earlier examples in film history that deal with recreating past particular events or past places, but really I thought this was a good place to start because you have examples such as Gone with the Wind and Ben-Hur, which were two of the most successful films of their era that really defined what the period piece had become, at the height of its popularity, at the height of studio influence in filmmaking in this golden age of Hollywood. These period pieces really set the bar for their generation. I mean, these were the big blockbuster movies of their generation, and also major award winners, kind of echoing back to our previous episode where we talked about the Oscars. These were the films that were very groundbreaking in terms of being big historical epics and recreating. In Gone with the Wind's case, you have the American Civil War Reconstruction era as that specific time period for that film. Ben-Hur is set in first century Jerusalem. So these are interesting examples of the period piece because they very much are about the spectacle. It is not so much recreating the places and a focus on having the most detailed and accurate depictions of life in that era. These are essentially focused on creating a grand story, and really the setting is more of the backdrop for the large scale of the movie. So a lot of people have kind of labeled these movies as romanticizing the era and essentially creating a mythic tale that does not in any way accurately represent that time period. As we move further along in history, looking at period pieces in the 1960s, 1970s, these were very different from the period pieces made in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and that's mainly due to a change in political climate. There was a much more of an emphasis on challenging traditional narratives, kind of like that you had seen with movies like Ben-Hur and Gone with the Wind, and more so taking a look at complex people throughout history. You see this with movies like Patton and Lawrence of Arabia, which are period pieces, but also biopics set during the wartime. Patton, obviously, set during World War II, and his kind of the story of his life and his involvement in the U.S. military campaign in World War II. With Lawrence of Arabia, his story involving the Turks and World War One, essentially. So you kind of see these are, for those people in the audience that have seen these movies, they know exactly what I'm talking about, but it is a much more critical and humanist approach to these people. These period pieces do not deify these characters, but they more so look at their life as a complex story, which every life really ultimately is. And with that, I think there is much more of an interest in historical authenticity and using actual historical records and basing movies, these period pieces, around those historical records. Now, a lot of these movies from this era, a lot of these period pieces from this era aren't necessarily the most historically accurate, but there is that shift in how they look at important figures in history. Moving on to the 1990s, essentially the end of the 20th century going into the 21st century, I kind of just lumped this area together. This particular time is when you start to see a shift in the period piece that is really kind of still in effect today, and that is what I would call the hyper realistic period piece. And these movies are really centered around recreating the small details, really perfecting the small things. And that's reflected in the actors' performances of real life people and, them perfecting a particular accent and the elaborate production design of recreating a specific area or era, and also the language. What kind of words were they using? How did they talk to each other? All of these things are kind of what are under the umbrella of what I would call the hyper realistic period piece. So I mean, movies like Apollo 13, Selma, 12 Years a Slave, Downfall. Hopefully by now you can probably see there's a popular trend with period pieces. They are mostly associated with biopics and historical epics. That's kind of the common thread. A lot of these movies using that historical setting more as a backdrop to focus on a particular period and more often a particular person's role in that moment in history. So with that, what are the most popular periods that are consistently recreated in movies? What are the ones that we see the most often? And I really narrowed it down to 3. Now, there is definitely debate, obviously, around what could be left out of my list that I created, but these are really the 3 that I think are most commonly recreated. And the first one is what I would like to call ancient civilizations. The period, really any period piece that depicts ancient Rome, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt. Think of your gladiator movies, the obviously Ben-Hur, which I mentioned earlier. Really, you see this era pop up far more often than you would initially think. This is a very crucial time in human history where I think there is just a lot of fascination around this particular era, and that's why you see it recreated all the time. My second one that I put was World War II. This is so obvious. I mean, you see war films, biographies, historical fiction centered around World War II. I mean, there's just so much going on during this period around the world, and so many countries are being impacted, whether they're directly fighting in the war or not. This is just such a huge moment in human history, and it really, it didn't even happen 100 years ago. So, of course, when you look at the history of film, it makes sense why this one is probably the most popular era to show up in the period piece category. And lastly, for most popular periods, I put the Victorian or 19th century Europe period, which this is where you see a lot of your classic literature adaptations. And I think these stories still are resonant with people because of the themes of class, gender, social issues. There's also you have your romances that are very iconic to this particular period. Stories like Pride and Prejudice, which have been remade many times, both in TV and in movie format. I think those are the top three for sure that we see that we think of when we think of the period piece. Those are the most popular settings. Now I want to switch gears and talk about what are the popular period pieces from other countries. So kind of taking a step back, looking outside of the US, what are the common eras in history that are recreated in international cinema? So the first point that I kind of have here is feudal Japan. So in Japanese cinema, you see this era of the samurais, and that era of Japan being recreated a lot, particularly with like the filmmaker Akira Kurosawa, which is arguably the greatest Japanese filmmaker of all time. But he worked a lot in this particular era in Japanese history, and that is a very important era due to the history of the country and how that the samurai, the role that it played in that culture, that was just a very popular thing with Japanese audiences, was that story centered around those characters in that time period. So what ultimately draws audiences into period pieces? I think it's a mixed collection of reasons. I believe that nostalgia plays a big role in attracting people to these types of movies, wanting to see the events, time period recreated, the attention to detail, seeing that up on the screen, every aspect of the environment, from the costumes to the sets to just the sound, also plays a big role. I think since cinema is such a sensual and intimate experience, you're in this dark, soundproof, well, not entirely soundproof, but it is a dark and very overwhelming environment for large picture, a large screen, and speakers kind of overwhelming your senses. And with that, you see a lot of period pieces being these big budget films that have a tremendous amount of money put into them to recreate these environments. And it's down to every aspect of the movie, from the visuals to the sound design to the music to the performances and the story. So all of these elements, I think, really make the period piece stand the test of time and make it still very popular even today. I mean, you look at the most recent examples of movies like Oppenheimer and Napoleon and Gladiator 2. There is still a drive to see these sorts of movies, and really it's ingrained in the old school Hollywood model of what is a successful movie. And I think that's going to do it for today's episode of Culture Shock. There was a lot we covered today, and feel free to leave a comment letting me know some of your favorite period piece movies and maybe specific periods that I left out that are worth mentioning in terms of discussing film history. So let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on those questions and your thoughts on the episode in general. Thank you for tuning in. That does it for today on Culture Shock. Be sure to give us a follow and turn those notifications on for immediate updates about future episodes. Also, if you like what I do here, give our social media pages a follow. That's @Culture Shock Podcast on all platforms. As always, thank you for tuning in.